as promised, we have a guest with us to continue our discussion in regards to this Vinegar Hill Forever theme show that we're starting with today. And if you weren't with us at the beginning of the show, like we said, we hope this to be a series. We're talking to folks today who are playing integral parts of the future and the present of Vinegar Hill. But it's not going to stop here. As I said, I spoke with the likes of Mr. James Bryant, Mr. Eugene Williams, to get their blessings, men who are cornerstones of our community. And so those of you that know, another cornerstone is the Jefferson School. And the lovely lady, who is the director of the mission of the African American Heritage Center at the Jefferson School, Miss Andrea Douglas. How are you, Andrea?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you all?
Good, thank you.
I'm doing well. Delighted to have you, Andrea. So first let me say that you came highly touted. I want you to know this because I don't know if anybody ever told you, but when I was speaking to some of the elders in the community about the show and who I should talk to, they said Andrea Douglas, even though she's not native to Charlottesville, Virginia, she did her research, and people appreciate that, the work and the effort that you put in over there at the Heritage Center. So kudos to you, Andrea.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We it's a labor of love. It's something that we inherited a program, and we inherited a history, and we are working as hard as we can to give honor to the history that we inherited. I think that when you think about African American participation in our city, it is an active participation. It is a self-determinant participation. It's one that even in the worst kinds of circumstances, it was a participation that respected community. And so as we think about how we create programs at the Heritage Center, that's at the heart of the work that we do. And we also want to be a place that we continue to think experimentally. So if it works, great. If it doesn't work, we move on to another thing, and until we continue to articulate a cultural representation of local Black people, but also of Black people nationally and globally.
Now let me ask, when you were doing your research into Vinegar Hill, tell me something that stood out to you the most, because as a director, that means you're in charge of making sure that your organization, is able to stand, is able to be profitable for one, to be able to at least meet the bottom line or whatnot. So besides like that piece being said, like just what gave you the unction really to be like, I need to put my time and effort into this story, into this history?
Well, I think that what strikes me about what I do every day is how little people know about it. How people, when we first started, I remember talking to a gentleman at the Paramount Theater who was maybe in his 50s, mid-50s, and he didn't know the history of Charlottesville. I've talked to people in their 20s and 30s who are just hearing about Vinegar Hill. And I think that when you fully understand that Charlottesville cannot be Charlottesville without this story, when you fully understand that the reality of the whole is the impact of the half, it becomes almost, it's necessary. It's necessary that we do this particular kind of work. And we don't want things to fall into the realm of myth, because honestly, Vinegar Hill is both reality and myth in some ways. And when we place this emphasis on the loss of Vinegar Hill, we also then lose, in some ways, the historic relationship of property and Black ownership.
Right.
And why that then becomes this watershed moment in that relationship. So we're not talking about the continuum of them of this kind of Black ownership. And so the work that we do at the Heritage Center really wants to articulate that
Now you said myth. Please elaborate on that.
Sure.
Yeah,
Well,
what you mean by myth?
Well, the reality of it is that when we think about Vinegar Hill, we think about primarily the end of Vinegar Hill. But what we're not thinking about is the moment of its construction, right? This sort of 1890s Piedmont.
Former slaves, right?
Well, former slaves, but people in the 1890s who create this land improvement company that create a kind of collective ability to buy property and own property, and these people then build a community. And by the time you get to the 1960s, if you look at the arc of community, there were parts of Vinegar Hill that, there are people who will argue that we're on the decline, but it's figuring out the arc. So when I say this kind of mythology of it, there are a whole lot of other places along the road of the history that brings us to that part that are equally as impactful as the end, and that we should be paying as much attention to those pieces as we pay to this last piece. And so in that regard, that's what I mean by that, because I hope that we'll think about places like when you ask yourself the question, how did African American people purchase all of those homes in Bridge Street or the Dice Street area, right? There's a question about economic collective action.
Yes.
That moment represents, and those are the kinds of things that I think we're missing out on in the narrative when we're giving the Vinegar Hill narrative.
And I think
I'm sorry.
I was just going to add. I thought it was just maybe grocery stores, but there were insurance agencies, restaurants, clothing and drug stores, barbershop, fish market, a tailor. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Sure. And it was a vibrant, and it also was, in some respects, it was a fluid space. It was certainly black-owned business, but it was not just only black people who occupied the space. There was some fluidity into it. And so then the importance to the larger community, from that perspective, you get to, understand it a little differently.
Ms. Douglas, how you doing, Ms. Reyes? I got a question for you.
Sure.
A lot of the things that I've read about Vinegar Hill that are posted state about how they didn't have sewer systems, or they didn't have water, they didn't have these particular type things. Is that the reason that they used against us to not help rebuild Vinegar Hill?
Well, I think that when you think about it historically, the not helping rebuild Vinegar Hill had more to do with a city who was basically segregationist. The fact of the not having proper water and things like that was not all of African American making. That was
But more parts of the city were like that besides just Vinegar Hill, though, right?
Yeah. Sure. But if you think about the moment and you're thinking about urban renewal as a project, urban renewal is going on all over the country right about at this time. And it's really thinking about how do we grow a city? How do we make sure that we create an economic center that is viable? And so there is this place within a racist society, honestly, that you have to look for those places that you can then label, I think the term was derelict.
Yeah, derelict,
And you can point to those parts of that then hold up that theory. But in reality, that Vinegar Hill was a mixed community, economically mixed, and in some instance, racially mixed. It wasn't just all black.
Are we entitled reparations?
Well, it depends on how you think about it. I mean,
because you said that there was ownership there.
Sure.
So when they moved those people out, did they compensate them by giving them another home? If they didn't, I would definitely think that they're entitled reparations.
Well, some people were compensated. Not everyone was compensated, and the question is, were they compensated at the appropriate level?
Were we allowed to vote? I mean, to make a decision like that? No.
Yeah, that was that poll tax that they held against us to allow a bunch of us not to be able to vote.
Right. Well, the Voting Rights Act is 1964. But in 1964, it's a fait accompli. It's already done. Right? They're opening West Haven in 64, so it's already done. But more to the point, the process doesn't end in 64. The process goes all the way through into the 70s. They start having conversations about Friendship Court and Garrett Square in 67. So this is a longer process than just Vinegar Hill, which is again this idea of displacement in the city is not just an isolated incident, and until we begin to look at all of that as a post-emancipation conversation that leads us to this moment, which is not the last moment, right? The building of the Garrett Square housing project means you're scraping away places where black people live in order to put them on top of it. You can't divorce the conversation about school integration from the conversation about housing, and how school integration proceeds, so does the conversation of housing. Because once you integrate the schools, where do you put the people? Right? So these aren't conversations that occur in a vacuum. There's a history that has to be read more holistically, and that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Thank you for that. We are speaking with Ms. Douglas of the African American Heritage Center here, talking about Vinegar Hill. So stay with us. You're tuned in to In My Humble Opinion. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Pastor Edgar Green of Eden Ministries would like to invite you to fellowship with them at their new location, located at 2900 Mary Meadows Lane, Keswick, Virginia. Worship services on Sundays at 11 a.m. and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Again, that new location is 2900 Mary Meadows Lane in Keswick, Virginia, adjacent to Stony Point School. Website www.eden-ministries.com.
We are still here with Miss Andrea Douglas, schooling us, giving us a good convo, dropping that knowledge on us about Vinegar Hill and the great research and work that she's doing. And we're going to dig a little deeper into that. But first, I want to kick it over to Aaron. He has a question for you, Miss Douglas.
Okay.
Well, first thing is Miss Douglas and I have something in common. We are both from the wonderful best borough in the world of Queens, New York. So,
I knew New York was working its way up there.
Don't let us get our accents on. You know what I'm saying?
Why New York dudes always do that? They got to reference where they're from.
Because we know we the joint, but that's all good.
Listen, some of us know that we're the home of rap. That's where it all started, where we came from.
Yeah, not the Bronx. Not the Bronx.
Oh, okay. We're starting something now.
Actually, my question from Ms. Douglas is that, because I love historians, and I wanted to ask her, during her research about Vinegar Hill, I'm sure that she has come across, and we were actually discussing a little bit off the break, is the common theme of all these prosperous black neighborhoods, probably, can we say all across the country, that have maybe experienced some of the same similar things that have happened in Vinegar Hill. Can you discuss some of the common themes you've seen? And then also I wanted to ask you, in any of these places where the neighborhoods were changing, examples of the people fighting to keep it the way that it was, or examples of people not being so quick to let gentrification happen. Are there any examples of that at all?
Well, I mean, my answer is kind of no, because urban renewal is occurring across the country in the 60s. And the laws that would make it difficult, let me back it up. 1964 is the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
1965 is the Voting Rights Act. 1968 is the Housing Act. And those three amendments are amendments that redress, some of the earliest amendments of our country. And so the ability of black people who were in one form or another disenfranchised in one way or another, you don't have the ability to recover even from those. But the flip side of that is that by the time you get the Civil Rights Act, the government no longer has the opportunity to act on your racial behalf, right? So it's a double-edged sword in some ways. So the idea of recovery, and then you also have to talk about, political power and where those powers reside. If you think in Charlottesville, you get your first black council member in the 1970s.
Right, that's not happening.
All this stuff is done and over.
Right.
And so, and where does it happen? It happens in Newark, New Jersey. It happened in Norfolk. It happened in Oakland. It's happening in places all over. And if you think about a place like Newark, it suffered in ways that its recovery didn't begin to really happen until the turn of 2000.
Wow.
Right? So you enter into an age of American history that then goes from the civil rights movement into Vietnam, that then goes into the 80s, where you have, unfortunately, in black communities, a drug epidemic.
Yeah.
Right.
And Miss Douglas, you made me think of, take today's Harlem and Brooklyn. So do you feel that we can maintain our culture but still grow economically? Because I hear a lot of people talk about, like a modern day Harlem and Brooklyn, some neighborhoods, how it's more opportunity now, but at the same time, it doesn't look like, the way that we remember it, sort of historically, the black neighborhoods. So is it sort of a give and a take there?
I think it is. I mean, if you look at the way in which we all operate, even the idea of maintaining a Vinegar Hill is a difficult idea with the advent of the big box store, with the advent of the internet and the impact of the internet and the impact of consumerism generally. I mean,
you good? I'm good.
There was a time when we didn't all have credit cards.
Right.
And our buying capacity was lessened. So the notion of, a mom and pop store, which is not to say it's a thing of the past, but those places that communities occurred, we are manufacturing community in quite a different way now. So I think that from the perspective of cultural reclamation, I think we are in the moment, a true moment of cultural reclamation as we speak. And
I'm sorry.
And so the cultural reclamation that we're looking at are in facilities that are beginning to approach this from historic points of view.
Ms. Douglas, you're a trailblazer, and I have a question for you. I've been impressed by you ever since I met you back when Max and Charles first started doing things over at your facility. What pushes you to do what you do?
I don't like to lose.
Hey, there you go. There you go.
I think, though, I have never not been given an open horizon. I don't necessarily know what it means not to have the opportunity to do something. And so it's really important to me to live in a world like that. And so if I can facilitate that, then that's important to me. And if I can facilitate it using the advantages that I have, I mean, to say that I'm qualified to do this job, I am. I'm not. I'm not saying that to be arrogant. I am.
There you go.
And so, given that fact, I should.
That's right. Amen.
And I think it's just that simple. When I began as the curator, I was the curator at the University Art Museum. And that is a rare fight. It's a singular job. I had just come from the Getty Leadership Program, which is a program that trains people or helps people who are at the brink of leadership to acquire the skills that they are so they can move into leadership. So all of these things sort of happened all at the same time. And I find the story of this place to be hugely compelling.
Right. And allow me to take it back to the reparation discussion I believe Razor brought up. Because and usually I am a proponent of such, but the issue I think we'll fall into is that the powers that be, every time normally changes the rules to the game to protect themselves, and I think that's the issue. So if I'm not, unless I'm mistaken, reparations in this instance for Vinegar Hill would be more of an emotional decision, than it would be like a legal obligation. Because to my knowledge, they misconstrued, the laws to justify the wrong they were doing.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think that my take on reparations is such that, if you go back historically and you look at even the very first vote that African Americans made in this community, right? They were voting for essentially the general right to be citizens. They wanted to go to school freely. They wanted not to be arrested. They wanted not to. They wanted to have fair housing. All of those kinds of basic civil liberties. That's what they were voting for. That's what they were asking for. If I could think about what a reparation would look like, it would be the freedom to do those things that which make me the most human, right? Because we don't have necessarily yet. There are ways in which our freedom to vote is curtailed. There's ways in which our freedom of education is curtailed. And that's been, in a nutshell, the sort of history of America.
And I wanted to piggyback on that a little bit, because that example of reparation that you gave, to me, that's a great one, but also what you and I were discussing without interference. Mm-hmm. Because you and I were discussing how a lot of these times, these prospering neighborhoods were doing so well, businesses burned down, different laws and things of that nature. Just allow the people to be people, right, without ruling them or interfering in their society and culture as well.
Well, ruling them with the notion that it's fair rule, ruling them with the idea that the way in which we control people isn't even coming out of a place of fear, right? Because you always have to ask yourself the question: what is the general fear here? We have the documents that articulate the punishment for teaching black people, for educating black people. We have the documents that articulate this idea of what will occur if you educate and give freedom to black people. These documents go way, way back. And so if you want to allow for reparations, at this point, I don't want your money. I just want you to take your boot off my neck.
Amen.
But I must interject there, though, that if you go back to what nearly 100 years of that vibrant inclusiveness of a black neighborhood, which wasn't just residential but business, then you take that away. You also add a mental, traumatization to that, to people, generationally. So in that regard, I can see the financial reparation part playing a big piece of saying how your because your financial well-being and sanctity of your neighborhood was taken away from you, which puts you behind, in the race of our economic development here in the city.
Sure, it puts you behind, but again, I would also argue that there is a moment where black people were culturally more cohesive, mm-hmm, where they looked out for each other, where they were able to create that community in spite of ever-tightening Jim Crow laws. I mean, by the time Vinegar Hill is in the 20s and 30s at its heyday, that's when America is tightening its Jim Crow laws. That's when America is being its most, where the terror of being black is at its height. The change in the influx in immigration in the 1920s, 1930s that leads to a kind of American xenophobia, that leads to an increased activity in Klan, that leads to violence as a way of control. Those are the kinds of things that if you look at the history of the Jefferson School, if you look at this history of this community became very there was a kind of consolidation and protection, and people looked out for each other under those circumstances. So I think that that given opportunity, the kind of trauma that we are defining and describing, you can find, I believe, and because I'm a historian that runs an institution like I do, that you've got to recover your heart, you've got to recover your core, and you've got to recover your soul. And within that story are these truly redemptive moments that provide example for people.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know if that's.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Now, Andrew, we're going to take one more break and come right back to close out. And if you would, prep yourself to really let the people know of these projects and these initiatives that you're a part of and that's going on right now. I know you have an event coming up for the community next weekend, but particularly, I know that you even did some grant research for potentially memorializing the history of Vinegar Hill and whatnot. So let's really dig into that so people can see how they can get involved.
Sure, great.
All right. Now we're going to go to break, and I have a dedication to you and Aaron. I got a little song for y'all because I'm an 80s baby. I'm a hip hop enthusiast.
Let me say this right now. If you play, I was gonna say I hate you, man. Why you do that to me, man? You need to play the bridge right after that.
South Bronx.
Don't do it.
I am H.O., Andrea Douglas, Aaron Simmons,
Max,
Sir Charles, Razor in the building. We had to do a little hip hop history there for a second. So for maybe some of the younger listeners that may not know what just went down. That was a little KRS-One from South Bronx.
We got LL Cool J. Yeah, and that's all I need to say.
That's right. Exactly. To go. I give it to you. Nobody did it better longer, right? So. Thanks for staying tuned, y'all. And as we said, we wanted to make sure we gave Miss Andrea Douglas the opportunity to let us know about the initiatives and the programs that she is a part of that we can support. Ones, pertaining, of course, to the greater community. She's always involved with that. But I also know that there are some things that she's doing to help commemorate and to sort of redevelop, Black economics within Charlottesville. So Andrea, just give us a little rundown of some of the work you have going on.
Well, one of the things that up front we need to say is that you all have to be at the Heritage Center on March 3rd, because March 3rd is Liberation and Freedom Day. Okay. Our celebration of that, because last year council recognized that day as an important day in the city. It's the day that the Union soldiers came in and emancipated the city. So it begins at the university with a processional, some activities over at the Rotunda, but they'll make their way down Main Street, stopping at some of the churches along the way, and then ending up at the Heritage Center. We'll have a little lecture, little conversation, reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is really important. We don't pay attention to that document enough, and what it actually says. And then, we'll do a little fellowship afterwards. We'll have some food and opportunity to talk. But some of the things that we're working on also, we talk a lot about massive resistance in 1958. And one of the projects I'm working on right now is a project that I'm calling the 1966 Project, where I'm looking for people who went to Jefferson School in the 6th grade in 1966, because I think that is an amazingly interesting moment, because this is the beginning and the end of segregation and integration. This is the moment where the city creates for itself an integrated 6th grade. And the stories of those children who went to school there, some of them for being in contact with Black people and white people for the very first time. Mm-hmm. And what that really describes is quite unique. And it's happening, again, 2 years after the Civil Rights Act, 2 years before the 1968 Housing Act. And so this is a very pivotal moment. And you know that this year is the 50th anniversary of 1968. In 1968, by April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. So the era of between 64 and 68, we really need to get into it and understand what's happening in our city at that point. What leads to the ability for Charles Barber to be the first black mayor, all of those kinds of things, right?
Yes.
So if anyone's out there that went to Jefferson in the 6th grade in 1966, if you'd give us a call, a contact, we'd love to talk to you about that moment. Some other things we're working on, there's so many things that we do in a day. But
now, there's one in particular that I saw. Didn't you get approved for a grant or some funding to create a monument or a memorial?
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a monument to Vinegar Hill that we've been working on for a number of years. It came out of the dialogue on race. But I have to say this: some of the things that people talk about when they are looking at this monument, and I would argue you should take another look at it and from another set of eyes, is this idea that it's not representational. But what I would say is that it is a monument created by one of the most important African American artists in our country, Melvin Edwards. He begins his career in 1968 in response to Malcolm X's death, and then becomes the most prolific sculptor in our country. One of them, there's another, Richard Hunt is the other well-known African-American sculptor in our country. But Mel Edwards is known for memorializing sites, black sites. So he's got pieces in Newark. He's got two actually in Harlem. And so to be able to install that object at the Heritage Center at what is essentially the base, the eastern boundary of Vinegar Hill, to create a thing that stands in direct conversation with those other objects that we've been talking about for a year, I think is an important opportunity for us.
Yes.
And so we're raising money. It's ultimately going to cost $350,000 to put in the object. We've raised some funds. What you're talking about is an NEA grant, an artswork grant that we got last year. So we still have a little bit of way to go, but we're hoping to create a groundswell of interest. The Heritage Center hopes to do an exhibition of Mel's work in the late fall, and to really give people an opportunity to understand this artist. And these are the things that I believe are most important when one thinks about how do you create a public and visual space in a city. Where up until a couple of years ago, when I first started doing this 5 years ago, there was this article in the Siebel Weekly about, the invisible black community. Well, how does a community make itself visible? Right? That's the project. How do you create some sense of being and being seen? And these objects do that work for you.
Right. And lastly, I definitely have to get you to leave your number one thing when it comes to those talking about the work that we're doing, even just remembering Vinegar Hill, and then in black business and community moving forward. In your research and your work, like what's that one thing that you feel that we as a community need to come together around to make this come to fruition?
Well, I think it's about support. I think it's about, really sort of saying, okay, I recognize that you are a person of color who is trying to care for yourself and your family. And I'm going to help you do that because I'm going to support your business. Right? I recognize the Heritage Center as an institution that needs to be supported, and so I'm going to support it. It is always about how does one create the connections that are truly about community. And if we're not supporting each other, we can talk as much as we want to about community. You can talk to your blue in the face about community, but there is what has occurred is a dispersion. So at some point, we all have to get to the place where we understand that it's the dispersion was out of our control, but the organization is in our control.
That's right. Very well said.
All right. Well, thank you. You're tuned into In My Humble Opinion. We've been speaking with Andrea Douglas of the African American Heritage Center. Thank you so much for your work. We appreciate your time with us.
Thank you. I appreciate your
Go to the Heritage Center. Stay posted.
All right. So thanks for tuning in, and you guys take
show.
care of each other. We'll see you next time.
And Aaron, you can introduce this song.
Yeah, I don't know. You ain't give me no intro, but here we are. Oh yeah, Jefferson Queens.
Hey, y'all be good.